Excellent. Thanks for that, Chris. Just confirming you can all see the screen okay?
Yes, I can see the screen.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks very much. So, yeah, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to run through navigating through the Data Security Protection Toolkit, essentially what it is and why we need it and why it's so important. So I'll jump right in, but obviously if you do have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them either as we go or towards the end of the session. So firstly, why do we need the Data Security Protection Toolkit? Let's start with this. I don't know, some of you may know who this is. This is a chap called Willie Sutton. He was one of America's most notorious bank robbers in the 1920s. He had a career spanning over 40 years and stole an estimated $2 million. Since then, he actually gets a thing called Sutton's Law. It's actually taught anecdotally in a lot of medical schools throughout the world. And essentially, it states that when you're diagnosing, one should first consider the obvious. With that in mind, and the reason that Sutton's Law exists is when he was asked why he robbed banks, he responded, because that's where the money is. And obviously, if we ask a modern day version of Sutton as to why they hack into networks, their response would simply be, because that's where the data is. And ultimately, that's what these attackers and hackers and bad actors are ultimately after. Sadly, we are seeing not just an increase in the frequency, but also the sophistication of the type of cyber attacks that we're seeing directly within the NHS over the past few years. It's almost every month, it seems, that more and more of these are hitting the news. And ultimately, that's why we need the Dspt. So what is it? Essentially, it's a set of compliance tools as an online self-assessment. It allows you to measure your performance against the National Data Guardians. There's the 10 data security standards there, and essentially see where you fit in line with those. It is mandatory, so it's something that you all have to, all NHS trusts and all medical organisations within the UK have to conduct. That's just for health and for social care as well. As you well know, there are already a lot of security frameworks out there. National Cyber Security Centre, obviously we have GDPR and the NIST directive, to name but a few. Ultimately, the Dspt does overlap some of these areas. So if you're already working towards NIST directive, or you are already GDPR compliant and working towards those sorts of standards, then it shouldn't be too much of a shift in gear into working towards the Dspt. But ultimately, it does cover a much wider range than a lot of these individual standards. And ultimately, the benefits that Dspt brings are it is a single standard source. The fact that everyone's going in the same direction, you've got that single standards, including for, your compliance and support for the health and social care sector. Proportionality, throughout the Dspt, when you're going through your submission, you have to gather evidence points based on the individual items and the DSS, and the range of complexity is proportionate to the complexity and the size of the organisations, whether it's an NHS trust or if it's a care home or even a GP, for example. Equivalence, obviously, as mentioned before, with things like GDPR and the NIST directive. If you're already working towards those sorts of security standards and you have information security management systems in place, they are recognised as part of this process, and you don't need to redo any of those things. You can just use that existing compliance as an equivalent for the Dspt. I think it helps drive a more cyber conscious behaviour. It's putting that at front of mind, not just for people on a day-to-day basis, people sort of at the coalface, as it were, but also within senior management within many organisations. And that's a big part of the Dspt. It's just making that, creating that awareness at all levels throughout the organisation. As a byproduct of the DSPT, if you're following it and you're collecting the evidence, it will increase your data accuracy. It will increase it by by gathering those quantitative evidence items, and just makes it your overall data accuracy much easier to obtain. It is a mechanism for monitoring improvements as well. So it's a scale. So you can see where you were this time last year compared to your latest submission, and it's very clear when you start to compare your submissions from previous years as to where you need to where you've made progress and what is left to improve on. And ultimately, it's the the reduction in total cost of that system. It's only a 1 year overhead, so you have to do it annually, but once you start that process, it doesn't take up much time to do. And compared to a lot of the other security standards and frameworks out there, it's relatively straightforward to complete. Now, I mentioned about the proportionality of that and how that's split. At the moment, it's split into 4 separate categories. The first category is NHS trusts and foundation trusts. They're sort of the larger, more complex organisations. Moving through to category 2, arm's length bodies. Category 3 is the busiest area. There's a lot that falls into category 3. Finally, GP surgeries and practices falling into category 4. Now, we don't, as part of the DSPT, it's not expected that GP practices and care homes, for example, are going to fall, have to follow the exact same standards as an NHS trust, which is why they've actually split that out. So there are different areas within the DSPT, depending on which category you fall under, as to the points you need to provide evidence for. So if you're in category 1, you're an NHS trust hospital, you'll need to provide evidence for 113 points from a total of 150 points. So you need to provide 75%. And as I said, it's not about pass or fail. There is a bar that you need to meet in order to to have that standards met status. But the concept is that once you're there, you don't just sit still. It's about continual improvement. It's about working out what left there, what else there is that you can be doing, and moving into that best practice. The submission for the 2020-2021 DSPT is June 30th of this year. As I said, the 2020-2021 version of the DSP toolkit has been published, so organisations are no longer able to publish their submission on the 1920 toolkit. So that is something to bear in mind. If you haven't started that process yet, or you've not, you're in the process of building your response, you need to make sure that you're responding to the right version, i.e. the latest version. So we're just going to have a quick look at the DSPT and in all of its glory. Now, some of you may be familiar with this this spreadsheet. Essentially, it's an evidence matrix. It's what you need to have in place in order to meet these DSPT standards. Some evidence areas are reasonably straightforward, but they're just sort of yes/no responses. And these are all for you that you're going to, as you're completing your self-assessment online. Others, they are a little bit more difficult and a little bit more complicated to quantify, and you're required to actually submit documents and statements associated with that. And all of these areas, it's assumed that you're, obviously you're pulling this information from somewhere. Now, there is quite a bit to get through. It is, as I say, it's straightforward to respond, but there is a lot that you need to go through. Now, if we just have a look now at what the 10 data security standards are. Again, these are broken out into 3 main categories as well. So the first is people. So the first, the data security standards, first 3, sorry, are all around people. The next 4 are around processes, and the final 3 are around technology. If we just go into a little bit more detail on each one of these. So the first data security standard obviously fits within the people element. And essentially it's about how sensitive and confidential data within your organization is processed. And by process, I don't just mean how it's generated, it's how it's accessed, where it's stored, or whether it's electronic or in paper form. Then we start looking at individuals within the organization and making sure that they understand their responsibilities when processing that sensitive and confidential data. And finally, it's about making sure that all staff are have adopted and are able to demonstrate that capability as well. Now, one thing is worth pointing out in these first three data security standards is it does say all staff. So it's not just your IT team or just people that, heads of departments or things like that. This is an organization-wide response. So we start looking into the next four data security standards. These all fit within the processes side of things, and ultimately it's about the processes and controls that you can put in place around your data security. The first of the processes being working towards a least privileged access model, which essentially means only providing access to data for those people that need it. Now, what I see fairly regularly in my day-to-day role are organizations that have open access. And that's where all employees, all users within an environment have access to that data. It's not just within public sector, it's not just within healthcare. We do see it in other industries as well. But this is specifically called that out, and you need to be, much like the GDPR, you need to be working towards that least privileged access model and ensuring that only people that need access to that data in order to conduct their day-to-day roles have access. It's obviously then about reviewing the processes and reviewing any lessons learned. So if in the event of a breach, in the event of a near miss, you need to work out the root cause of that. What can you improve? What can you put in place? Is there additional training that's required? Are there any processes that need updating? Are there any technology elements that you need to introduce? And again, it's all about reviewing and discussing those lessons learned and seeing how you can continually improve. Looking at the sixth data security standard is around essentially what to do in the event of a breach or an attack. Do you know what that process is? Do the people involved, whether it's your data protection officer, your CISO, your CIO, does everybody involved in that workflow, are they all up to date with what the process is, who to contact? Even if it's bizarre as making sure people have the right contact numbers, whether it's for calling out of hours IT, whether it's for calling a third-party supplier, whatever that happens to be, that process needs to be in place, needs to be tested, and everyone needs to be made aware of it. And then finally, item 7, or the fourth item within processes, is about responding to a breach. So again, in a breach, what would you do? What are the next steps that you would follow? And finally, we move on to the last three data security standards, which all fall into the technology element. So the first one there is it's quite a standard one. Basically, don't use unsupported products, whether they're operating systems, software, browsers, etc. It sounds like quite an obvious one, but specifically within the NHS, there are, I was speaking to a trust yesterday, and they have still got Windows XP network connected machines because they are connected to very expensive scanning equipment. And those scanners are, the software to run those scanners isn't available on any other operating system, so they have no choice but to continue using that OS. Improvements can be made in terms of disconnecting them from the network, etc. But it's not always as straightforward as that. The Dspt does call that out, that in order for you to meet these requirements, you need to firstly know where these unsupported operating systems are, and you need to put a plan into place to be moving away from them. If we move on to Data Security Standard 9, it's about having the appropriate security controls in place. and whether that's from a from a cyber threats perspective, and also making sure that you've got those as granular technical controls to discover breaches and things like that. And finally, the last data security standard is about your suppliers, and ultimately you can hold them accountable. Make sure they're doing their part. I'm sure you've all heard of the SolarWinds or the Sunburst supply chain attack. Ultimately, where organizations using that particular product had faith, as all people do in their vendors, and ultimately it was the vendor that was breached, and malware was injected into automatic updates as part of that SolarWinds process. So it was nothing to do with the individual organizations themselves that got breached. It was the fact that their supply chain got breached. So it's items like that, making sure that you're aware of those, and the vendors that you are working with are following strict cybersecurity standards as well. And again, we're just sort of highlighting the headlines here as to each of the data security standards 1 through 10. I'm not going to read through them all, but again, you can have a copy of this presentation afterwards if you'd like to go through it in any further detail. So how is it divided and how is it split up? So obviously we know we've got these 3 categories: people, processes, and technology, and the weighting there as well. So 26% of the evidence points required are from people, 36 in processes, and the remaining 37 sits within technology. So the red bars, red horizontal bars, indicate the number of evidence points that you need to obtain within that item. So if we look at the first one, the DSS1, you need 22 out of 28, or 22 points out of 28 evidence points in order to get that standards met for DSS1. All the way through down to 10, where you only need 4 out of 10 to meet those objectives. Now, if we just sort of manipulate this table quickly and spin it so that we've got the highest weighted elements on top, they account for about 80%, I mean 79 point something, about 80% of the DSPT evidence requirements, and they are DSS 9, 1, 6, 4, and 8. So firstly, what do hackers want? And how do they get what they want, basically? So ultimately, they want your data. They use malware and social engineering to get in. They exploit misconfigurations, vulnerabilities to establish persistency. And once they're there, they compromise accounts, compromise devices, move laterally within the organization to locate and find the data, and finally to exfiltrate it. Now, we've been looking at this for some time now, and we're starting to gather some quite interesting trends. Now, in 2019, we had a relatively small cybersecurity team at Varonis, just 3 people, all based in the US, and they conducted over 650 investigations into our customer base. And what they saw was that 41% of those investigations were brute force attacks, essentially. Only 6% were ransomware, 18% were insider threats. So this is just essentially the state of play as it was in 2019. As I said, it was a very, very small department of just 3 people. We've since grown that team. We've now got people all over the globe. We've got forensics teams, we've got malware researchers, we've got people that solely concentrate on reverse engineering and also threat hunting as well. And as part of these investigations at Varonis, we run what's called a DRA, or a data risk assessment. Think of it as a proof of concept, if you will. We're working with a customer sort of middle of last year, running through one of these data risk assessments, and we were noticing some strange activity within their environment. It wasn't anything that they were expecting to see either. And it was actually a large building contractor who were responsible for delivering the Nightingale hospitals. And we detected they were under attack from a nation state attack. essentially the intent on encrypting and holding their data to ransom. And the way that the Varonis tool or the Varonis platform works, is it's data centric. So we're not an endpoint protection, we're not perimeter detection. We concentrate on the data and the users that then interact with it. And because we were able to see that an individual user account was encrypting data at a much faster rate than was considered to be normal, we then took preventative measures and stopped that ransomware attack from spreading. So in the end, it was just over 100 files that were encrypted, as opposed to the potential millions that they would have had. Now, if we then sort of skip forward to 2020, we see that the ransomware is starting to increase, the insider threat is starting to increase, malware, but more importantly, it's the cyber criminals and APTs, and it's actually a 300% increase in the number of investigations that we've had a week. We've got a much larger team now. We've got a lot more services that we're able to offer because of it. And ultimately, it's, as I said, it's not just the number of attacks that are increasing, it's the sophistication of these attacks as well. So we're seeing things like thread hijacking, where an attacker will actually reply to an email that you've sent. It could be an email that you've sent requesting a document, for example. So the attacker will respond to that from the person that you've sent it to. So as far as you're aware, it's completely legitimate. It's very difficult to detect these just by looking at the email itself, and it will have an attachment on it, and you don't suspect anything untoward because you've asked this person to send you an attachment, and that's exactly what's happened. Only it's not the person that you've the intended recipient that sent you this attachment, and before you know it, you've then opened this attachment and you've introduced malware into the organization. Sometimes it will impact things straight away. Other times it's all they need, and it will just gain persistence and they'll just sit there and wait. I mentioned the SolarWinds, the supply chain attack, but also the number of insider threats that we're seeing, where employees, new employees are being brought on, and because they have so much access and so much so much access to sensitive data from day one for every single new employee. A lot of the times, these new employees are either malicious within their intent originally, or they're being paid, bribed by nation state attackers in order to provide access, provide data. So there's a whole sort of underworld of this type of activity that I don't think a lot of people actually see as being happening in the real world, but we're seeing a huge increase in this type of activity. And the attacks I've just mentioned as well, obviously, these are all specifically designed to bypass the endpoint protection. So a lot of them will not be picked up with antivirus or things like APT. And then finally, if we look at the latest stats, we can see that actually APTs and criminals activity is pretty much 50% of what we're seeing now. And again, the team's going even further. We're able to conduct many more investigations per week. And we saw towards the end of last year, towards the end, October 2020, there was the egregor, which was an APT. It first attacked an organization called Barnes and Noble. And 3 months later, 3 or 4 months later, we actually detected 19 variants of that same APT. And that's exactly what happens. As soon as these attackers find something that works, they'll use it until it's detected, and they'll just tweak it and make a variant, and they'll keep running with it. And at the moment, it's now sad state of affairs, but it's not really if you get breached, it's when you get breached. And that's what we need to be planning for. It's when you get breached, what can the attackers gain access to? And ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. And that's why it's so important to make sure that your unstructured data, and especially your sensitive data, is being monitored. I'm sure a lot of you have had these sorts of emails as well, and seen it over the last 12 to 18 months or so. And this headline is: "The internet is drowning in COVID-19 related malware and phishing scams." Now, the eagle-eyed of you out there will notice this is from March 2020, so this is from last year. And ultimately, it was a whole host of people essentially trying to make some money out of the COVID-19 pandemic. As I said, March last year, but what we've actually seen is March last year, there was around 300 related fraud cases relating to COVID. It's gone up and down throughout the year, but it's currently in the last set of statistics, it was currently sitting just under 700 individual attempts of fraud and scamming activity based on COVID alone. So as I said, this is an increasing problem. It is getting worse. They are getting more sophisticated. So, how can Varonis help with all of this? If we start by recapping what the top 5 data security standards for DSTP were, we look at DSS9, which is the technical security controls. So looking at threat detection and response, making sure you can detect any abnormalities, make sure you can detect how data is being accessed and processed within your environment, and making sure that the data itself is protected. And we look at data privacy and user awareness, and making sure that users are storing their data correctly, it's being processed in the right locations, and ultimately the individuals in question know what their responsibilities are. We move into the processes side of things, again, more into the threat detection and response, and it's about ultimately implementing detective controls to prevent breaches, and ultimately what your incident response plans and steps are. Data protection, least privileged access, preventing permissions essentially from permissions bloat. We often see with failures in the joiners, leavers, movers process. Moreover, in the movers, if I'm honest, where people will start in one department and they'll move from that department to a new department, and when they begin a new role, more often than not, they'll get new permissions because they've started a new team or a new department, and very rarely do their previous permissions actually get revoked. And that happens, over a period of time. And you might have someone that's been in the organization for 10 or more years, had 2 or 3 different roles, and they've actually got more permissions, a lot more permissions into sensitive data than they actually need. And finally, things like patch hygiene, and making sure that your the platforms, the operating systems that you are using are updated, are supported, and that you're not using any unsupported software or hardware. Now, those top 5, which accounts for 80% of the DSPT evidence that you need to gather, we can very easily align directly to part of our standard messaging, if you will. So the Varonis platform is all about providing visibility. Essentially, it's we turn the lights on to your data, and it's that visibility to where your sensitive data is and where it's overexposed. So we provide these dashboards within your environment, and it will look at your servers, look at where your unstructured data resides, and it will show you exactly where your sensitive data sits, where it's consolidated, who has access to it, and more importantly, where we've got over permissive access. If we're talking about Office 365, specifically SharePoint Online, OneDrive, and Microsoft Teams, that brings a whole host of new data security and data protection issues to it. The whole concept of permissions management is completely flipped on its head. And users have got the ability to share data inside and outside of the organization. They can share data externally. So if a file was to be shared with me, you'd have gbayliss@varonis.com appear within your Azure Active Directory permissions on that particular file or folder. But it can also be shared publicly, which means you're creating anonymous guest access permissions, and anyone that's got that URL has access to that data. So it's all to do with how data is being shared, how it's being processed, what type of sensitive data and confidential data is being stored in SharePoint and Microsoft Teams. We also look at your VPN, DNS, and web activity, and we're able to ascertain where individuals within your organization are accessing malicious websites. And it's not just like your standard proxy, it's looking at things websites that are known phishing activity or known malicious websites, for example. And it's not until you start digging into your DNS, which is just generating millions and millions of events every single day, it's almost impossible to go through that manually. Until you start seeing these types of items and seeing where they're picked up and what's actually happening within your environment. And we're not suggesting that individuals within the organizations are actively accessing these malicious websites. They may well have undetected malware that's accessing it, or applications and software that's talking back to command and control outside of your organization. You need to be monitoring all of those platforms to ensure that you have visibility and you can detect that type of breach. Starting at the data protection, again, talking about the least privileged access, it's almost impossible for IT to do this on their own. Ultimately, and bizarrely, my first job was working for an NHS trust in Essex, and you just don't have the context. You're told that this person is starting in this department, so you put that user in that group, and that's, as far as you're concerned, you've done your bit. But ultimately, you don't know which specific folders that user should have access to. There may well be sensitive data, confidential data that those users shouldn't have access to, and you've accidentally or unknowingly given a higher level of access than they actually need. So we have the concept of data owners, where the actual business owners, the heads of departments themselves, are overly responsible for saying who can and can't access their data. There's a number of ways we could do that, but the most efficient way of doing it is through this sort of web portal, where the data owners themselves receive an entitlement review. They click on the link and essentially they get a list of people, like you can see in the background here, a list of individuals that have access to their data, or the data that they're responsible for. And they can simply go through that list and click keep or remove, and put explanations in as well. So it's all logged, it's all audited, and then confirm. And those changes are automatically updated and reflected within the permissions and within Active Directory. So the end users themselves, the data owners themselves, they don't need to know anything about Active Directory. They don't need to know anything about NTFS permissions and whether they need full control, read, write, execute, list, modify, etc. It's, do you want them to access the data, yes or no? And ultimately, the Varonis platform will talk to Active Directory, talk to the file servers, and make all of those necessary changes. Talking about Active Directory, it's probably, or arguably, is one of the longest serving applications within most organizations. I'd say would have started out as a Windows NT4 domain and it's probably been migrated and updated to where we are today. Unfortunately, throughout that process, a lot of those legacy misconfigurations and security risks that existed back in the days of NT4 are possibly still there today. As the UIs are updated, some elements of Active Directory user computers just aren't visible anymore. One of those is accounts with no password policy. So I'm sure you've all got group policy objects that enforce password complexity rules. But accounts with no password policy it's a hidden attribute within users and computers. And essentially any account that has that set, you can have a null or a blank password. So it completely bypasses your complexity rules, and they can just set their passwords to blank or to or completely empty, basically. We'll look at things like your admin accounts with service principal names. These are accounts that are easy to get the details of. Anybody in the organization can request those tickets, they can take them offline, and they can run through a process called Kerber roasting, and they can then log back onto the network with admin level privileges. And finally, looking at in terms of unsupported operating systems, unsupported platforms, we'll actually scan through your Active Directory objects and highlight any particular computer accounts that have risky operating systems. And again, we're looking at things specifically for Windows XP, Windows 7, Server 2003, and things like that. So how do we do all that, and how do we pull all that together? So we start by looking at your enterprise data stores and your supporting infrastructure. So that's your on-premise Windows file servers, you might have NAS devices, Linux, Unix file servers, etc., as well as your Office 365, so SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, OneDrive, Microsoft Teams included within that, and then the supporting infrastructure behind that, so your Azure Active Directory, directory services on premise, your VPNs, DNS, and web proxy. And we take all of those logs, we take all of the metadata available from those sources, and we bring that in and we build a framework within the Varonis data security platform. And we start by classifying all of that content. So we go through every single file in every folder, in every share, and we run it through our content classification engine. And we essentially just align the classification categories to that data. So if we detect GDPR data, then we'll mark that as GDPR and it contains PII information. We're looking for PCI, we're looking for clear text passwords, and there's a whole host of content classification rules built into the platform out of the box. But also we've got the ability to create custom rules. And for 2 separate trusts I'm working with at the moment, we're looking to create custom rules searching for medical imaging files, because the issue that they had was that they had no idea where they were. They, in their own right, contained PII, and it's just trying to manage that and work out where these are stored and who has access to them. So we know where all of the sensitive data is within your environment. We then start looking at your users and groups and the permissions. So we're able to determine not only where your sensitive data is, but who has access to it from looking at from the users and groups. Then we look at the access activity. Now we know who has access to this data, and then we can tell you who actually is accessing the data. And the delta there is obviously these over permissive access, where an individual user or a security group has access to data and they're not using it. Well, that doesn't meet least privilege access, does it? So again, it's about highlighting that those areas and presenting it to you through the form of the various web UI dashboards, and allowing you to make, allowing you to prioritize the remediation steps that you need to take. Then we take into account the Active Directory telemetry and also the perimeter telemetry. And we combine all of those elements together, ultimately to build up what we refer to as a peacetime profile. So we look at, as I said, right at the beginning, we're looking at the data and we're looking at how the users interact with that data. So with these user behavior profiles, we know that an individual logs on to the same device day in, day out, or it might be a handful of devices, but we work out what their standard pattern of behavior is. They access the same types of servers, the same type of data, same type of sensitive data in the same sort of hours during the day. They log off at around the same sort of time every evening, and we get that pattern. And that we build those individually for every single user account within the organization. And then if there's a deviation there, or we see any abnormal behavior, then we start issuing alerts. And that's how we're able to then feed that into our data protection, privacy compliance, threat detection and response. And sort of how we actually work, it's not a case of coming in, setting up the software and sort of leaving you to it. It's a little bit more to it than that. And we've run this operational journey. We've have over 8,000 customers now, and this is a tried and tested methodology. So initially we look to detect where we're looking at the individual threats, and we analyze and classify your data, and we highlight where and prioritize where your sensitive data is being processed and who has access to it. Then we look at preventing this by remediating your key areas of risk to any data stores, and obviously any over permissive access that we have. Finally, we move into the sustain side of things, which is ultimately about providing automation and continuous improvements. And we, as I said, we work with organizations day in, day out doing this, and with Bytes as well, who are more, we're working with them to deliver these capabilities on a everyday basis. And sort of where do we sort of start with all of that? From our standpoint, it's a data risk assessment. I've mentioned it a few times throughout the session. Ultimately, DRA, data risk assessment, is, think of it as a POC. We'll set up the software in your environment, and we'll look to run through these particular use cases. So we'll look at your remote workers, we'll look at any insider threats, look at your compliance, are you ransomware readiness checks, looking at your Office 365 estate, etc. And we'll go through and we'll classify all the data, and we'll just provide that visibility and the insights to your data that you just currently don't have. And with those insights and with that visibility, it gives you the information that you need to help respond to the DSPT. Now, I've mentioned classification a handful of times, and this is a very crude way of demonstrating it, but I think it works quite nicely. Essentially, what we do is we open up every single file, we work out, we see where sensitive data meets the rules that we've set. We then mark those as those files are sensitive, and the rules and the patterns that they've gone through. Now, the logic behind it is we're looking for keywords, we're looking for a dictionary of terms. We then validate those as well. So things like PCI, for example, if we find a 16-digit number, we're not just going to assume that it's a credit card or debit card. We'll then do a LUN validation check, make sure that it meets the algorithms that card issuers use. We then use proximity word searches. So we'll look for things like CVV, expiry date, etc. Anything that you're going to have on your card. Do we find any of those terms in and around where we found that 16-digit number? If we do, then it improves the confidence that that is in fact a sensitive file. And again, we can do all of this with custom rules as well. Now, from the user behavior analytics side of things, it's all about collecting these events. Now, this is an example of a typical event that someone has accessed a file, and you'd get the person's name, what's been accessed, where that lives, where they come from, and sort of the time and date stamps as well. But we actually enrich that information because we're looking at so many different areas within the organization. We're connected to Active Directory. We know whether the data is sensitive. We're looking at DNS. We've got these the ability to work out based on IP information where these people are based. So in this instance, we know that the account that is being used is David Johnson. We know that that user is an executive based on his behavior. We know that the data he's accessed is sensitive. It contains PII. We know the IP address that he normally uses and the IP address that he's using at the moment. And all of that, we then start to learn and build these profiles. So we know this pattern, and this is all standard behavior for this particular user. Now, if we start to see any abnormal areas from this particular user, then it's we can start flagging. So we've seen things like accessing it from new locations, for example, or different times of the day. And then we start sending out these alerts. They appear in the console. They can also be sent to via email or go to your SIEM tool, depending on what type of threat it is. Like our ransomware detection tool capability, as soon as we see any type of ransomware, we'll actually disable the user account itself and disconnect any live sessions that they have. So it actually stops that in its tracks. You get detailed information about the individual alerts, about the account that was used, what machines were used, the domain, the time of day, and you can dig into any of those bits and pieces as well. And ultimately, it's about providing visibility and answering these questions. So is my data at risk? Am I compliant? Can I detect a breach? And they're relatively straightforward questions, but when you pose them, a lot of the time you just sort of get stumped faces looking back at you. Now, as part of working with Varonis and with Bytes, we do offer free security training. And this isn't just for our own products. This is just standard security training. So it will look at things like Office 365 and cyber incident response. It will look at web security, and ultimately it's available to everybody inside your organization. Now, a lot of organizations, we have annual requirements for health and safety, or for harassment in the workplace, anti-bribery training, that sort of stuff. And there's absolutely no reason why cybersecurity shouldn't be included in that. And it forms part of the Dspt as well. Just some other services that we have, as I mentioned, the incident response team and the forensic services. We have the ability to reverse engineer malware. We offer purple team simulations where we actually conduct a real live ransomware attack in your environment, on your servers, obviously completely in a controlled manner. but we'll look at how your platform, how your environment is going to react and respond to that type of threat, as well as just sort of the standard threat hunting that we do. So looking at the just a recent example of results, sorry, of one of these purple team incidents, just a quick look on the left-hand side. These are some of the attacks that we'll carry out, where they hit on the kill chain, and whether or not this particular organization was able to detect these. Some they were, some they weren't. In this instance, the ransomware and DNS exfiltration, which are the two biggies, were not detected. So, as I said, it all starts with the data risk assessment. By going through the data risk assessment, you will help you answer these questions, and ultimately will give you that increased visibility, increased insights, which will help you complete your submission for the DSPT. We literally need like 2 or 3 virtual machines. It takes a couple of hours to get it installed, and so you've still got time between now and the end of June to run a data risk assessment to help you respond to your to build your submission for DSPT. So that's everything that I had. Thank you very much for your time. I've run slightly over than anticipated, but hopefully you've all found that beneficial. Chris, do we have any questions that have come through?
No, nothing come through yet. The one question, I hope you can now see my slide. The one question is about sharing the slides. So our marketing team, following the end of this session, will prepare the recording and then pop it on our website. If you click on the software link on bytes.co.uk, then you'll see to the right of the screen a webinars on demand section. You can see all our previous webinars there, so something to review if you see something of interest to you. If you do have any questions, then feel free to pop those in the chat. If I can just go and see the chat. Otherwise, we will, if you can see, have a look at the link there on the screen, the SurveyMonkey link. Please do give feedback. We do like to monitor the success of our webinars for you, and make sure that they're all relevant and high quality. Alternatively, you can scan the QR code on that as well. But I don't see any further questions. I don't know whether any of my colleagues can see any of the questions. I can't seem to see the question chat window at the moment. Okay, well, I hope that was a worthwhile use of time for you. Very interesting. Thanks to Greg from Varonis for doing that. We'll be in touch with you, obviously, just to see what follow-up we can do. And again, use the survey to request a follow-up. The deadline is looming for the submissions for this year. And as Greg has mentioned, it's a very quick process for us to do an assessment for you and get you on the road to assisting you with that. Thanks for everybody saying thank you for this. I can see the chat window now. So thank you. Thank you for attending.